My name's Albert Myers, and I'm an alcoholic. By the grace of God and the fellowship of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, people like you in conferences like this, and my pretty Al-Anon wife, I haven't found it necessary to take a drink since September the 7th of 1973, and for that I'm eternally grateful. I didn't want to disappoint Clancy. Don't want him going back to Texas and give a bad report right away. I want to thank Alan and the committee and whomever is responsible for the invitation for both Sally and myself. We are delighted and honored to be here. And I want to thank Bob and Shirley, Clyde and Phyllis, if you will, and what great hosts and hostesses they have been. And I don't know who's responsible for the fruit baskets, but thank you for those as well in our room. You've covered all the bases, and we thank you very much. This has been a very special weekend for Sally and I, because we know all of the speakers, and getting to see Jack and Gay, and to be with our friend Babs that we've known, I guess, almost from the beginning of my sobriety. And then Sheila, Sheila's right. I remember we had a long talk one evening, well into the early morning hours, and this was not for her. We just growled at each other for a long time. And yet when I heard her speak, there was that moment of clarity for her. There was that moment of vision. There used to be a fella in East Texas that said there's a little piece of white velvet on the inside of each one of us that even God doesn't permit us to soil. And I think there comes that time for all of us, and that's why we're here. Clancy has, irreverent Clancy, he has touched me from the very beginning, and no matter how many times I hear Clancy, there is always something about his message that seems to awaken me and to arouse. I think it's his enthusiasm for the program, his dedication to the program, his activity in the program that always seems to catch me and mesmerize me for a minute. So I'm delighted, And the Al-Anon speaker yesterday afternoon was pretty terrific. You really don't need to hear my story if you were here yesterday, because she pretty well outlined my activities for you. But so it's nice to see old friends and some new friends from East Texas over in Kilgore, Alan and his covey of beauties that he squired around all weekend. That's been nice to see. It just cost you 20, didn't it, Alan? See, somebody told me that they could each have 10 apiece if I did that, so I just want you to know that's rigged. It's when you had the countdown last night, you have no idea how meaningful it is when you see people like Geneva and Eva and the gentleman with 38 years and Clancy with his 35 or 6, because when Clancy talked about last night the change that's taking place in our fellowship, he's absolutely right. Last year, Sally and I were very privileged to be at a meeting with an old gal, a charming lady called Geraldine O.D., known to some of her constituents as God. And Geraldine has been around the program for about 45 years, and after the meeting, one of the young ones went up to Geraldine and said, "What's the difference between Alcoholics Anonymous today and when you came in 45 years ago?" And she said, "There's a big difference. When I came in 45 years ago, there were 5 old-timers to every newcomer. And today there are 10 newcomers to every old-timer. And as much as I think the newcomer probably is the lifeblood of our program, I'm still convinced that the old-timer is the heartbeat. And one without the other doesn't have a great deal of value for us. But you put them together, the blood and the heartbeat, and it puts together the ingredients for recovery. And when they read this morning, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. You know, hey, I'm in gratitude to the old-timer who has created and cleared the path for me to walk. And so it's very meaningful to me to sit in the audience like yourself and to watch the old-timers like Geneva and Clancy and Babs and all of you that were here last night that have more sobriety than I do, because I'm going to need you. There is a quote in the AA Comes of Age. Dr. Tebow says, regardless of our veteran status in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, at any time the disease of alcoholism can return. And normally it's in the form of halitosis. And I don't mind telling you, in my 12th year of sobriety, I went deaf, dumb, and wonderful all at the same time. And it must have been something for Sally to watch, because I made financial investments that I thought were wonderful, and people around me that loved me a great deal said, no, I don't think so. My sponsor who loved me said, I don't believe I would move that fast. And up here, my alcoholic ego said, if you knew how wonderful I was, you wouldn't talk to me like that. And I got hooked up with some personalities that I wasn't compatible with in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm not being critical. I just wasn't compatible with the personalities that I got hooked up with all of a sudden. And people that loved me a great deal, and my sponsor said, I don't think you're really that compatible with them. And up here I said, if you knew how wonderful I was, you wouldn't talk to me like that, because in time they will see it the way I see it. And in my 12th year of sobriety, I was going crazy. And I had reason to be up in Prince Albert, Canada, with an old-timer up there by the name of Cease, that I'm sure many of you know. And I was talking to Cease, and I said, Cease, I'm in my 12th year of sobriety, and I'm going crazy, and I'm going to conferences, and I'm sponsoring people, and I'm going to meetings, and I'm doing all of these things, and I'm going crazy. And Cease listened to me for a while, and then all of a sudden he said, Albert, it isn't that you're doing anything wrong. It's that you're not doing some things at all. And I said, what does that mean, Cease? And he said, well, you remember when you first came in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and you were all torn up and beat up and bloody and you got real serious about the program? I said, you bet. He said, our problem is in time we get less serious about the program and we start to get serious about the personality. And sometimes we get so busy picking up the pieces that we drop the program. And C said to me, I'll bet you don't read your 24-hour book the way you used to. And boy, he was right. I used to read that little 24-hour book every single day, and I'd squeeze the pages together to check out how much sobriety that I had. And then C said to me, I'll bet you don't read pages 86 and 87 and 88 anymore. And he was right. I used to take that big book in the middle of page 86. It says, On Awakening, tells me exactly how to conduct myself during the course of the day, how I'm to think, thy will be done, not mine, and eliminate the fear and the anxiety and all of the things that I seem to carry on a day-to-day basis. And then C said to me, I'll bet you don't pray like you did when you first got here. And he was right. When I first got here, I was saying things, God, get me out of this one, God, and I won't do that again. Get me this job, God, and I won't bitch. And then he said to me, I bet you don't meditate like you did when you first got here. And he was right. I had the ability to get so quiet, and I could hear you, and I could listen, and I couldn't meditate anymore. And then C said to me, I'll bet you don't even support your home group the way you did when you first got here. And I had to go back and start doing the things that I did the very first day that I got to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because if you don't protect the thing that's protecting you, you can get in big trouble in sobriety. And I'm just here to share that with you. Because you have to understand, sobriety has not altered my thinking all that much. I'm still competitive, I'm tenacious, I'm compulsive, I'm not moderate about anything. I kid about it, but it's true, and I talk about it. I can still get an evening's entertainment out of a dozen cookies. It's just crazy. I go to the store and buy a dozen cookies, and I put them in the bag, I put them in the cart, and I begin to watch that thing. Now, I know there are people that buy cookies, take them home, and put them in the jar and wait for company. My mind doesn't work like that. Once they're in the cart, I begin to think things like, I wonder if I can get through the checkout counter before I have one. And then I put them in the car and take them home and set them up on the counter, and I say to myself, I'll have two. There is something in my chemical makeup that makes me circle through the house like a hawk. And I begin to circle through the kitchen, and then it dawns on me, I say to myself, I wonder if I can leave too. I've been known to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go, oh my God, there's a cookie left in the kitchen. So you have to understand that sobriety has not altered my thinking all that much. I was listening to Clancy and to Jack and to Sally and to Babs. I was listening to all the speakers, and that common denominator that we seem to have, that skid row of the soul, that gnawing sensation of inadequacy that I don't fit. I was listening to Sheila, that I just couldn't be a part of, and I could relate to that sensation, that I was either better than you or not as good as you, or I looked up to you or I looked down to you, but I could just never fit. And I think one of the miracles of the program is that for the most part, I live in a world today where I fit. And I think I was probably addicted to approval a long time before I was ever addicted to alcohol. And when you're addicted to approval, you do things that you don't want to do with people that you don't want to be with in places that you don't want to go. Then you become very easy to manipulate. And people talk to me about my attitude, and people talk to me about my behavior a long time before they ever talk to me about my drinking. And I think that's part of the deceptiveness of our illness, that by the time it deceives you and by the time you deny it, you can look right at it and say, that's not my problem. If I had more money, I wouldn't have the problems that I have. My creditors never called and said, Albert, you're drinking too much. And I don't know about yours, when they called, they wanted money. So I just never saw the illness in its proper perspective. My perception of it was just, that was not my problem. I drank in high school and college and in the service, and you hear alcoholics get up here and tell what happened to them in the service, and my experience was much the same. Whenever I drank, I seemed to get into trouble. I never got up in the morning and said to myself, I wonder what I can do today to get into trouble. To the contrary, I got up every morning planning how to stay out of trouble. I remember one time I was in the service, and I was late getting back to the barracks. It was absent without leave, and one more time some shore patrolmen picked me up and put me in front of this provost marshal, and this very responsible person was not talking to me about my drinking, but was talking to me about my behavior one more time. You and I are dealing with a disease powerful enough to kill people that don't have it, and that's why there are a lot of people in this room. I got out of the service in 1946 and went back to Iowa City, Iowa, which is my home. Both Sally and I are Iowa farm kids. And in the fall of 1946, I enrolled in the University of Iowa. And as Sally mentioned, I was engaged at that time to a lady that I had been dating in high school and in the service. But one January, a fraternity brother of mine and myself walked into a little Iowa tavern. And for the first time, I saw the lady that talked to you yesterday afternoon. And I remember seeing Sally for the first time, just as I'm looking at her now, and she was absolutely the most gorgeous, stunning, beautiful thing I had ever seen. And I remember in my own mind saying, that should be mine. Alcoholics don't court anything, we just capture it once we see it. And I remember saying to this fraternity brother of mine, do you know that girl? And he said, that's Sally Sears from Des Moines. And somehow I managed to get her telephone number, and I called her and convinced her that it would be a very good idea if we dated and went out for the evening. We are cunning, baffling, and powerful. Even knowing that it was her friend and I was engaged to her, somehow we rationalized the fact that we should date. And in true alcoholic fashion, just for the next 3 weeks, just around the clock, the intensity that we get when we want to throw a net over something. And about 3 weeks later, I got drunk and cashed in all of my war bonds. I asked Sally to meet me in front of the dorm, and she agreed. And I remember being so drunk I could hardly get the car parked, and Sally came out and got in the front seat of the car, and I put the ring on the wrong finger and said, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could have me for the rest of your life? And she said yes. And we had talked about my drinking, and I had promised her when we were married I wouldn't drink that way. When we had children, I wouldn't drink that way. When I got the good job, when we bought the house, I would not drink that way, and she had nothing to worry about or nothing to fear. And an interesting thing, we were married in June the 19th of 1948. Last June, we've been married 45 years. And when she deserves that. That's for you. You deserve that. And, an interesting thing. When we got married, we were two young kids, and that addiction to approval that I had as an individual, we took that on as a couple. And we wanted so desperately to be accepted by you and the neighbors and the people in society. And we didn't know how to do that. We had no idea what it was to function for the well-being of another person or how to love each other. We were just two young kids in love, and we were just going to make this thing work. And our parents helped us buy our first little GI house, and on weekends we would drive around and look at the big houses in neighborhoods that we couldn't afford at that time. And one time we saw a house with a red door and a brass kick plate. We went home, painted our door red, and put on a brass kick plate. And another weekend we drove around and saw black shutters, and we bought shutters painted in black and put them on our house. And then we bought shrubbery that looked like your shrubbery, because we knew one day you'd drive by our house, you would nudge each other and say, "That's a really good-looking house. Should be, looks just like yours." And the trap that Sally and I fell into from the very beginning was, if we looked good on the outside, you would think we were okay on the inside. And when you structure a love affair and when you structure a family, trying to please you, you can't do very many healthy things for yourself on the inside. I've always said God's most precious gift is turned over to rank amateurs, because we didn't know anything about having children. We just started having them. And we have a daughter and we have 3 sons, and I've always been in sales and marketing, and by and large I've always worked for large and major corporations, and I was working for a company called Owens Corning Fiberglass, and had received a large promotion to go to New York as part of an executive management team to introduce a new product. And I remember that Sally and I were so excited to go to New York, and she mentioned this yesterday. Of all the moves and the transfers and the promotions and the things that we're involved in, I'm not aware at any time that Sally and I ever sat down and said, is this going to be a good move for the family? Is anybody going to get hurt in this move? Are any of the children of an age where they're going to have to move up a grade or back a grade or possibly get hurt academically? Because in the alcoholic home, you don't have that luxury. We didn't anyway. Whenever we had the opportunity to move, Sally and I would say to each other, it will be different this time. This time it's going to be different, and we're going to keep track of all the checks in the checkbook. And we would say funny things like, if we had another bedroom or a larger yard or get next to the school or close to the church, it will be different this time. And we never saw the disease of alcoholism. Sally never called me an alcoholic. We went to New York, and I went to my offices at 56th and 5th in the Glass Building. And if you know anything about New York, that's up in the high-rent district. That's up in the Bergdorf Goodman Tiffany Plaza Hotel type area. And Sally took the children and went up to Westport, Connecticut, and found a lovely old family home, a home built in 1812 by a sea captain. And if you had stopped me at that time and asked me how things were going in my life, I would have said, great. I have this beautiful wife and these 4 lovely children and this great job with this company, and hey, I'm just doing great. And on the inside, I had that dying sensation, that bleeding, that dying while you're living, and you can't identify it, and yet you know something's wrong. I used to commute into the city and then commute home in the evening on the bar car. And sometimes if I thought I would have too much to drink, I didn't go home because I just didn't care for the wrath. And fortunately for me, the company had maintained suites in New York. So if I had too much to drink and thought I was going to get a little wrath from Sally, I would just make an excuse and stay in the city and not come home. And one Friday night I did come home, and I had been drinking and I was drunk. And as I came through the back door, Sally made some comment about my condition. And whenever Sally would begin to comment about my condition and bore in, I would go into my alcoholic defense mechanism, which was one-line sarcasm. God, I loved one-line sarcasm. I could just tear you apart with it. Didn't create any black and blue marks, didn't draw any blood, and I just loved it. And what was most important was Sally always reacted to the sarcasm the same way every time. And I'm not sure what I said that night, but whatever it was, it backed Sally up, and her shoulders would get straight, and she would raise up, and she would always say to me, "Do you mean that?" I would say, "Do I mean what?" And she would say, "What you just said." "What did I just say?" "Well, you know what you said." "No, I don't. Tell me what you think you thought you heard." And then Sally would tell me what she thought she heard, and then I could really go into my routine, and I'd say, "Oh, God, you took that all wrong. You know, I did not say it like that. I did not use that tone of voice." And if we would talk to each other long enough, invariably she would say to me, "Albert, I'm really sorry for misunderstanding." And once the alcoholic gets in that position, it's all over, because we say, "Well, by God, you should, as hard as I work." I mean, once we get in the driver's seat, we just take it all away. Now, the insanity that we talk about in step 2, is we didn't do that once in a while. We did that time after time, week after week, month after month, year after year. I had been traveling in Texas and got back to New York drunk, leased a car, and driven up to Connecticut. And when I came through the back door that evening, there was a different Sally waiting for me. She wasn't talking about my condition. What she was saying to me was, "I would rather be dead than live the way we're living." And I remember saying to her, "Why don't you get some sleep and it'll look better in the morning?" And on a Saturday morning in Westport, Connecticut, the only lady that I have ever loved said to me, "I would rather be dead than live the way we're living." And she took a razor blade and she headed toward the bathroom, the master bath, and she was talking about slashing her wrists and killing herself. And I remember yelling at Sally and saying, "My God, don't kill yourself. Please don't slice your wrists. If my drinking bothers you that much, hey, I won't drink anymore." And the 4 children are standing right behind me as I'm yelling at their mother, "Please don't slice your wrists. Please don't kill yourself." You see, I'm a very tangible alcoholic, and I've already told you, if I don't see blood or black and blue marks, I figure I haven't hurt you. It never occurred to me that I could steal your peace of mind. And when I talked to the children, they said, "Hey, it wasn't the shoving and the shouting and the pushing and that kind of thing. It was that you stole our peace of mind." And how many times, I wonder, have those 4 children stood behind me while I'm yelling at their mother, "Please don't slice your wrists." Or how many times I've called her a bitch, and those kids have to get up the next morning, and try to go to school with a mind that lets them think. And that was the destruction that was going on in the home of alcoholism. And you couldn't see it. The sad part about our illness is it has no scar tissue to it. The insidious part about that is you can't measure how badly you've crippled someone from the outside. And I've been very sensitive about that in recovery. Sally and I have been very privileged to work with Alateens and sponsor Alateen groups and go to Alateen conferences. Bab and Sally and I were talking about that this morning. And I had a 15-year-old boy that I was working with that was getting beaten up on a regular basis. He called me one night and told me he was going to kill himself. I said, "Oh, hey, Jack, don't do that, partner. Hang on. I'll pick you up in the morning. We'll work something out." And I picked him up the following morning, and I remember saying to Jack, "How are things at your house?" And he said, "They sound pretty good." And the statement startled me. And I always talk about this because I said to Jack, "What do you mean they sound pretty good?" And this young man went on to tell me that the disease of alcoholism has a sound to it. He said, "Mr. Myers, I can put one foot in the house and determine the condition of the home immediately by the sound. There's either too much noise or no noise at all, or yelling or sarcasm or profanity or flesh hitting flesh or furniture hitting furniture. Depending upon what I hear, that's how I protect myself." And he said, "When I hear the wrong sound, I go to my room, I turn the lights down and the stereo up. Or maybe I get on the phone and try and call somebody that I think will understand. But if the pain is too great, I just go back out on the street, because there's less pain on the street than there is in the alcoholic home." And then he made a very profound statement to me. He said, "Mr. Myers, if the sound of your house is the same today as it was a year ago, chances are you're not growing." And Sally and I began to talk about the sound of our house in recovery. We took an inventory of what our house sounded like. And there was still sarcasm in sobriety. There was still profanity in sobriety. There was still harshness in sobriety. There were very innocent statements that caused a lot of pain in sobriety. On a Friday night, I would come home and I would say to Sally, "How would you like to go out for dinner?" And she'd say, "Sounds great." We would get in the car and start down Central Expressway in Dallas, and I would very innocently say to Sally, "Where would you like to go for dinner?" She would say, "I don't care." I'd say, "Let's go to Vincent's and get some seafood." She says, "I don't feel like seafood." I said, "Well, let's go to the Split Rail and get some barbecue." She says, "I don't feel like barbecue." Now you have to understand, we alcoholics are sensitive, and we don't handle rejection well. And the way I would handle it is I just say, "Well, then, damn it, let's not have dinner." And we just turn the car around. We may or may not eat the next day or two. I mean, that's the way we solved that problem. And anymore, when Sally and I get in the car and she looks at me and I say, "Where would you like to go for dinner?" She'll say, "I don't care." And I say, well, let's talk about it. One of the things that Sally and I didn't know how to do when we got here was communicate. The illness had made us dirty fighters. Hey, we knew how to draw blood, we knew how to take, and we knew how to cripple you, but we didn't know how to communicate. And I want to tell you, God works in strange and funny ways, because we had an opportunity to go back to Shreveport shortly after we were in the program. And we used to carry a big book in the front seat of our car. And we were driving from Dallas to Shreveport, and Sally said to me, "How would you like to have a meeting?" And she said, "When two or more are gathered together, God is in our presence." And I said, "It sounds all right for me." And so she said, "My name is Sally, and I'm a very grateful Al-Anon." And she talked. And a strange thing happened. I listened. And when she was all done, I said, "Well, my name is Albert, and I'm an alcoholic." And I talked, and a strange thing happened. She listened. And then she talked, and I interrupted, and she said, "We're in a meeting." I said, "Oh." And from that moment until this moment, when Sally and I have to discuss a problem that needs the principles of the program, be it money, be it children, be it sex, be it whatever it is, Sally will say to me, or I will say to her, "I'd like to have a meeting." And when we have a meeting and we bring God into that meeting, and we bring the principles of the program into the meeting, it's incredible what happens to us, because we don't have to become competitive, we don't have to win. And I share that with you, that having meetings has been a very saving grace for Sally and I. I got my arms around Sally that morning, and we took her to a psychiatrist. And we always took her to a psychiatrist. And I don't know how alcoholics do that, but somehow we can convince you that if we can get you fixed, we won't drink so much. And basically what the man said is, you're a couple of Iowa farm kids and you're out of your element back here in New England, and if you'll get in a car and go back to Iowa and get surrounded by family, don't travel so much, get your finances straightened out. I remember his comment. He said, "This thing will go away. This thing will go away." And Sally and I wrote all this down. As he was telling, we just wrote it down, and sure enough, we went back to Iowa, close to family, big house next to school, close to church, enough bedrooms, big yard. Should have been perfect, except we didn't write down there the disease of alcoholism. And the peculiar part about that was, if you were here to see Sally or hear Sally, her father came into the program in 1952. Had over 25 years of continuous sobriety before he passed away. When I made it in 1973, I said to Dad, "Dad, my God, why didn't you talk to me about my drinking? I took everything that you loved the most in this life. I took your daughter, I took your love, I took your money, took your booze. Not once did you ever talk to me about my drinking." And he was a wonderful man, and he had these kind of piercing blue eyes. And I remember he looked me straight on and he said, "You would have resented it so much coming from me that it would have ruined the opportunity for the right person to reach you." And then he said what I've heard many times in the program, that God made us all different, so we need each other. If he made us all the same, one of us wouldn't be necessary. But more than that, he's gifted each one of us with the ability to touch one other human being that nobody else can touch. And I'm willing to bet that everybody is sitting here this morning Because at the right time, the right person had the ability to reach in, grab you by the heart and say, hey, I've got a way out. You don't have to hurt anymore if you don't want to hurt anymore. Don't you know that for 25 years, Sally took her best shot? Trust me. And she had some other people take their best shot. And one morning in a halfway house in Shreveport, Louisiana, a 74-year-old retired electrical contractor that I had never seen before in my life said to me, you don't have to hurt anymore if you don't want to hurt anymore. And I haven't had a drink since. Must drive wives' Al-Anons crazy. Don't you know that Sally wanted to know what that man said? And the real secret was it wasn't anything that he said. He had the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous carved in his life so I could see it, and I wanted to be like him. God, I was noisy, and he was quiet, and I was nervous, and he was calm, and he was the opposite of everything that I was, and it just mystified me as to how in the world does he do that? I would love to do that. I became pretty much of a periodic drunk, and I don't know anything about periodic drunks or how they work other than the fact that I became a very good one. And I could go 3 or 4 or 5 months and get everything back together and get my job together and the household back together and the love for my lady back together. And I would dress about like I am now and go to lunch, and we'd have 2 or 3 martinis and somebody would say, let's go to Chicago. And I'd say, sounds wonderful to me. And 3 or 4 days later, people would ask you that question, why did you do that? And you could give them a lot of dialogue, but you could never answer the question. And all I will tell you about periodic drunks, if you do that often enough, strange people will gather in your living room. And I did that one too many times, and when I got home that morning, they were there, and you recognize them right away as you come through the door. They're just lined up over there, and usually it's the attorney or the doctor or the next door neighbor and your wife. I mean, you know right away they're there for you. And they began to say funny things like, you, pointing at me, need to go to the alcohol and psychiatric clinic at the University of Iowa. And when the evidence becomes so tangible that you can't wiggle anymore, you start to say funny things like, okay. And on a Monday morning at the University of Iowa, the alcohol and psychiatric clinic, a psychiatrist was talking to me about my drinking, and he said, Albert, when you drink anymore, you hurt people. I said, that's true. He said, when you drink anymore, you get in a lot of trouble. And I said, that's true. He said, some people are allergic to strawberries. When they eat them, they break out in a rash. He said, your problem is when you get an ounce of alcohol in you, you have hives of the brain. And I remember saying to John, hey, I'm kind of allergic to alcohol. He said, basically, that's right. But he said, what you need to do is talk to somebody from Alcoholics Anonymous and go to an AA meeting. And a gentleman who is now dead by the name of Gil Voss did exactly what it tells you to do in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, working with others. And he took a very busy Friday afternoon that he didn't have. And he told me about himself and about the guilt and the shame and the degradation and the DWIs and the bankruptcies and the separations. And it was a terrible story. It was a terrible story. And I remember going home and telling Sally, I said, it was a terrible story he told. If I get that bad, I'll join Alcoholics Anonymous. And he and his wife took Sally and I to a meeting that night in September of 1967, and a man stood up much like Bill did this morning. He said, my name is, and I'm an alcoholic. And I remember saying to Sally, at least this is the way I perceive it, hey, get me out of here. I am not like them. And the children would get to be 18 and they'd go off to college, and I'd think how wonderful they're going off to school. They never came back. Once they got out of that alcoholic home, they stayed out of that alcoholic home. The daughter had written me a letter one time saying, you'll always be my father, but my love for you will never be the same. And I remember reading that over and over again, thinking, what have I done to destroy the relationship with my only girl? And the oldest son hit the campus of the University of Iowa in the late 60s, and it was a very rebellious time. And he got involved with drugs and used and trafficked and jailed and married and divorced with a youngster before he was 20 and another youngster in a relationship with no marriage. And I remember Sally and I would sit down in the quietness of our kitchen and try to figure out what in the world is going on with Charlie. Certainly that's not the values that we wanted for our children. And the middle son just left. There wasn't any confrontation, no dialogue. It just seemed to me I came to breakfast one morning and Tom was gone. And little John, he just was so small he couldn't get out. You know, age just wouldn't permit him to run. And there came a time when they said, we're going to sell your house and we're going to keep the equity. And we said, okay. And we're going to have to auction off your furniture and we're going to keep the equity. And we said, okay. And as I stand here this morning, and as I always do when that flashes back, I look down at Sally, and I can just almost picture Sally, myself, the 4 children standing on the lawn, and the house is gone, and the furniture's being auctioned off, and we didn't see the disease of alcoholism. I used a friend. I really called in a blue chip, an executive friend of mine from Owens Corning Fiberglass, the company that I'd been fired from. And I remember telling Dick, I said, hey, Dick, I'm just not capable of going through interviews anymore. I need your help in getting a job. And he got me a job in Shreveport, Louisiana. In 1972, I went down as district manager for this company. And as Sally mentioned yesterday, it was a year when I just drank around the clock. I just would get up and start drinking so I could get through the day, so I could get through the night, so I could get through the night, so I could get through the morning. And sometimes I got home and sometimes I didn't get home, and sometimes I knew where I was and sometimes I didn't. I remember calling Sally from time to time in my territory, say, hey, talk to me long enough so I can try to figure out where I am. You know, I could drink myself into oblivion, and the wonderful thing I would do is call Sally and say, hey, try and get me back to sanity if you can so I can work that day. It must have been a wonderful thing for her. It was unbelievable. I was drinking one night in a place called Shreve Square, and as I left, I looked in the rearview mirror and I saw these red lights going around, and I had heard about Caddo Parish police deputies and they're mean and they're ornery, and I thought I'll be very careful when I get the car parked and I'll be ready for them. And these 2 Caddo Parish police deputies came around to the left side of the car, and I rolled the window down. They asked for my driver's license, and I said, you bet. I just handed it to them out the window. And then I made a grave error. I rolled the window up, drove off, and left them standing there. All I can tell you is don't do that. And second time they got the car stopped, there wasn't any dialogue. It just seemed to me that they pulled me through the window and threw me up over the hood, and the handcuffs are going up the back, and I'm thinking, God, I hope nobody's watching this, and cars and people are going by, and they get me down to Texas Avenue and put me in jail down there in Texas Avenue, and do the wonderful things that they do for DWIs. And I remember the fellow said, we're going to have to put you in a cell, and I said, terrific, and they just kind of swung me around and pushed me in there head first, and as I turned back around, the bars were coming together, and then that wonderful sound that God created for drunks in jail when those bars kind of go. And for 1 second, I saw myself in my office in the glass building in New York overlooking Central Park to the jail cell in Shreveport, Louisiana. And I thought, damn, you got a problem. Maybe. And then the man said you could make a call. And when the man said I could make a call, that scared me because I didn't have anybody to call. People that had loved me for a long time said, don't call. We don't care. And God works in strange ways, because a man that was not in the program, a customer of mine, I called him and he came down. Frank got me out of jail. And I said, Frank, let's go get a 6-pack and straighten this out. And he said, no. Why don't you spend the night at my house? And in the morning, we'll try to figure out what to do with you. And God, it was such a degrading sound. And I said, what do you mean, try to figure out what to do with me? God, I don't want to be the way I am. And I remember he had a big bottle of Pepsi-Cola in the refrigerator that night, and I just kept pulling on that Pepsi, and I was watching this big kitchen clock, and it got to be exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, and I called an Episcopal priest, Father Paul at Holy Cross Church, and I said, Father Paul, this is Albert, and I'm in big trouble. And he said, can you get down to the church? And I said, yes, I can. And we began to talk, and he said, Albert, I want you to go to this halfway house. It's called the Bridge House on Stoner Avenue. There's a 74-year-old retired electrical contractor down there that I think you can relate to. And up here I'm thinking, how in the hell could I relate to a 74-year-old retired electrical contractor in a halfway house? I'm kind of a high-class New York guy. But when you're cornered and the heat is on and you're trying to get the pain out of your life, you're saying funny things like, okay. And at 10:30 on a Friday morning, I walked to the halfway house, the Bridge House, and I walked in, and there was a long table in the Bridge House. If you've been in the Bridge House, Susie's over there shaking her head. She knows the inside of the Bridge House. And there's a long table there in front of the coffee bar, and these three old guys were sitting there, and Bill Smith, and one of them said to me, when did you have your last drink? And that should be an easy question. I could have said just last night. But there came that time for me that Sheila talked about. I knew it was over. God, and I began to cry, and I said, I had my last drink last night, and I got these $1,200 worth of hot checks, and I got this DWI, and the house is gone, and the furniture's gone, and 3 of the 4 kids are gone. I'm about to get fired, and they're trying to pick up the car, and Sally wants to leave, and I could hear one of those old guys turn to the other one and say, boy, he sure sounds like one of us, you know. Next guy said, would you do anything to get sober? I said, God, I'll do anything. And the third guy said, would you go to 7 meetings in a row? 7 meetings in a row. God, I swung over my shoulder, and there those dippy slogans were. You know, first things first, easy does it. And I said, my God, they're talking about Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's frightened me, and I kind of straightened up in the chair, and this marvelous old Louisiana man said, Albert, we need to go for a ride. I said, you bet. Well, and we got in the front seat of his car, and we started driving. I said, where are we going, Bill? He said, we're going to Shumpert Hospital. He said, I have a friend in the alcoholic ward over there, and I want you to meet Sister Germaine. And I thought to myself, he's checking me in. I know what he's doing. And on the way over to the hospital, he set the hook in me. Wonderful man. Big, old, tall Louisiana gentleman. He said, you know, Albert, I never did quit drinking. That's all he said. I started thinking about that. Never did quit drinking. The priest is right. I can relate to this guy. I don't know how he's doing that, but I love the cure. And we met his friend, and we met Sister Germaine. On the way back to the halfway house, he set the hook one more time. He said, you know, Albert, I never did quit drinking. He said, as a matter of fact, I may have a drink tomorrow. And I took the bait. And I said, Bill, how long have you been doing that? He said, what's that, Albert? I said, that's not quit drinking. He said, 27 years, but I may have a drink tomorrow. But he said, you need to know something, Albert. Nobody ever took my right to drink away from me. And I don't know what I thought you were going to take away from me. And somehow that phrase kind of set me free. It gave me a freedom of saying, hey, you know, I can be whatever I want to be. And Bill said, you'll be at this halfway house at 10:30 every morning. And I started saying funny things like, yes, sir. First morning I was there, he said, you're not going to travel on the road anymore. You're not going to sell. I said, Bill, that's all I've ever done. He said, I don't care. I said, what am I going to do? He said, you're going to sell used cars. I said, I've never sold used cars. He said, you're going to start. I said, yes, sir. And I went to a place called Donaldson Dodge, a fellow that I used to play golf with, the country club. And I said to Mr. Donaldson, do you have a job selling used cars? And he said, no, I don't. But he said, I'll tell you what, the offices need painting, and if you want to paint the used car offices for the next 2 weeks, we'll get you started there. And I said, thank you very much. And Bill came by every single day, and he would roll the window down, and he'd say, are you all right, Albert? And I'd say, I'm fine. And then that night, he and Ruth would take Sally and I to a meeting. He came one day, I'd been there for about a week, maybe 10 days, I can't quite remember. Bill came by one day and he said, I think I know of a place where you can get a good job. I said, you're kidding. He said, no, there's a pipe place out here just outside the city limits. He said, I'll take you out tomorrow. And sure enough, he came by right on cue, put me in his car, and we drove out there. And a peculiar thing happened. When we got to this pipe place, he didn't drive up in front of the office. He stayed out at the end of the parking lot. He said, go in there and see if you can get a job. I said, who do I see? He said, I don't know. He said, ask for the man that hires or fires. I said, you're kidding me. He said, no. He said, you need a job, don't you? I said, yeah. He said, well, ask for the man who hires and fires. I said, what'll I tell him? He said, why don't you try the truth? You haven't tried that in a long time. I said, Bill, I just had this problem with alcohol. I just got out of jail. He said, that's what you tell him. I said, you're kidding. And I went in, and I asked for the man that hired and fired. And we sat down, and I went back to his office, and I began to tell him what had happened to me. And the guy's eyes got about this big. He just couldn't believe what I was telling him. And we had been in there about 10 or 15 minutes. I remember the man turned to me, and he said, you know, I can't use you right now. But he said, if you'll come back about the first of the month, I think I can use you. And I couldn't believe it. It was my first lesson in honesty. It was just incredible. I couldn't wait to get back out. First I was going to tell Bill, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, and I can't wait to get back out here to tell you how dumb that was, and it didn't work. You know, and I had to sit down in the car and said, Bill, you'll never guess what happened when I was honest with that guy. He came by a couple days later and he said, we need to get you a sponsor. I said, Bill, aren't you my sponsor? He said, I'll always be your sponsor. But he said, you need a sponsor that you can relate to every single day. He said, there's a fellow that travels on the road for RCA and stays sober. I said, you're kidding me. That's not possible. He said, yeah. He said, I think he would be a good sponsor for you. You could relate to him. Did you ever notice who we turn our life over to in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous? On a Thursday night at the Highland Group in Shreveport, Louisiana, I'm looking for a fellow by the name of Hoss Ross. And I said to a couple of the guys, when Hoss shows up, point him out. Wasn't very long, through the back door, about over there. Goofiest looking guy you ever saw. About 6'4" or 5", weighed 135 pounds. He dressed all in one color. And the guy said, that's Hoss. I went over, I said, you Hoss Ross? He said, that's right, son. I said, you travel on the road for RCA and stay sober? He said, that's right, son. I said, Bill Smith says you'd be a good sponsor for me. Would you be my sponsor? He said, I'd be honored. He said, you got one of those big books? I said, not of my own. He said, you do now. Bought me a big book that night, and he wrote in the front of it, to a long life in the fellowship, Hoss Ross, and his sobriety date. He said, you belong to any group? I said, no, I don't. He said, you do now. And I signed a card that night to the Highland Group. And I want to tell you, Hoss called me every single day. Remember when Jack was talking last night? Get in the car? That's my kind of guy. He would call me every single day. He'd say, what are you doing, son? I'd say, nothing. He said, I'll be right over. And I told Sally after about 2 weeks of that, I said, boy, I've made a terrible mistake. I cannot shake this guy. He called one night and said, what are you doing, son? I said, Hoss, I'm busy tonight. He said, good, I'll do it with you. Hoss told me things that I thought no man would tell another man. And Hoss taught me courage, and Hoss taught me honesty, and a lot of what I do, a lot of what I say, and a lot of how I feel, I do because of Hoss and Bill. They're both dead now. But on December the 13th of 1973, Sally and little John and myself drove to Dallas, Texas, and we didn't know a soul, not a soul. And Hoss said to me, when you get to the Dallas city limits, you call a fellow by the name of Wilson Maddox. And I remember Sally and I got to the city limits, and boy, I used to do exactly what my sponsor told me to do all the time. I wish I could say that now. But I stopped the car, and I got out, and I called Wilson Maddox, and I said, Wilson, this is Albert Myers, and on the other end, I heard this voice that Clancy was talking about last night. Albert, you old alcoholic, my God, it's so wonderful to have you in Dallas. And I'm going, this is incredible. You know, I left the sanctuary of Shreveport, and I just got to the Dallas city limits, and here is the same thing that I always get with Alcoholics Anonymous. God, it's so wonderful to have you. God, it's so great to have you near us. We need you so much. And he said, Albert, I can't be with you tonight, but I want you to go to the Preston group. And there's a gal down there waiting for you by the name of Mary Libb. And Sally and I had never seen a group that large. It used to be above the old dance studio, I guess, the Arthur Murray dance studio. There was a crowd there. It seemed to be about the crowd that you have this morning. That was the size of Preston then. And they had a little cubicle office that was covered by glass, as I recall. And Sally and I came through the front door, and we were scared to death, and we were just kind of standing there. And this little Mary Libb just stepped out from under this glass, and she said, Albert. You know, I don't know how we spot each other, but from across this room she said, Albert. And you know, that was our reception to Dallas, is no matter where we went, people seemed to have been there before we got there, and they knew us by name. You know, the very first night that I came to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous at the Southfield group in Shreveport, Louisiana, there was a little gal there by the name of Quincy. And as I came through the door, Quincy grabbed me and she said, Albert, it's so good to see you. My God, I'm so glad you're here. You know, and that's the feeling that I've always had, Sally and I found a group called Alpha. She described that a little to you yesterday. And Sally and I, with our 45 years of marriage and 20 years in the program, are the babies. We picked up a couple the other night that have 53 years of marriage and 38 years in the program. And they talk to us like they're kids. They say, you kids going to enough meetings, you kids talking too much at conferences. It's a wonderful thing. We still have a place to get our cup full in the program. Sally got very active in Al-Anon, and you know, she is an incredible lady in an Al-Anon, not because she's married to an alcoholic or a drunk, but because she's very active in Al-Anon and brings the principles of the program into our home and into our love affair for each other. And I have great love and great respect for all of the Al-Anon ladies. And I got very active in Alcoholics Anonymous, and it began to come together for Sally and I. We were able to get a house, and one evening Sally and I were chairing a meeting, and a man came in, and obviously very troubled, and Sally, just out of courtesy, asked if there was anything anybody liked to talk about. And this guy's arm shot straight up in the air, and he said, I'd like to talk about something. He said, I just got out of this treatment center, these 4 kids, and boy, for about an hour we tried to get a net over him. And at the end of the meeting, I went over and I said, my name's Albert. He said, my name's Jim. He said, what do you do, Jim? He said, I'm regional manager for Owens Corning Fiberglass. I said, oh, God. And I became his sponsor and his friend. A couple of years went by, and Jim said to me, why don't you come back to work for Owens Corning Fiberglass? And I said, oh, Jim, I don't think that's possible. He said, yeah, it is. He said, we've changed our position on alcoholism. We have a very active employees assistance program, and of the 24,000 employees, over 2,000 of them are in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I wrote a letter to a man in Toledo that I had known when I was with him the first time, and it was funny because they asked for a resume, and I knew they had one, so I just gave him an AA resume. September 6th, driving while intoxicated, jailed, Shreveport jail, sold used cars to me. I just sent it back up to Toledo. It wasn't very long. They said, come up for interviews. And the very first interview I had that day was with the corporate interviewer. And it was funny because I sat across this desk, and this little tiny smile showed up, and he said, you know, I can't ask you the questions that we normally ask people. But he said, I've been dying to meet you. He said, of all the years I've been with Owens Corning Fiberglass, I've never seen a resume where a guy starts out in jail. And don't you understand and know that my ability to do that reflected all the way back to the day where the guy took me to the parking lot? Because what it says and how it works is those of us that don't make it are those that can't get honest with themselves and this simple program. And I have to remember that as much today as I did the very first day that I got here. because my tendency every once in a while is not to show you everything, and I have to be very careful not to do that. I worked for Owens Corning Fiberglass. I went back and I was with them about a year, and I was playing racquetball and I had a heart attack, and I didn't know it. I had a silent heart attack. I just had a little pull in my back, and the following day I told Sally, I said, boy, this pull in my shoulder is a little more than I'm comfortable with. And they took me to the emergency ward over at Presbyterian, and after the examination, the guy said, I hate to tell you this, but you've had a heart attack, and shut down the whole right coronary area. And they just took me from the emergency ward up to the intensive heart care unit. And if you've ever been to intensive heart care units, they're very fussy, and they have little plaques on the wall that say family only, 2 people only, 2-minute limit visit only. And I was wired for sound and going in and out of the oxygen, and Sally and one of the sons had been there, and as I came to the second time, this black guy that I sponsor was standing at the end of my bed, and I said to Bob, Bob, how the hell did you get in here? He said, I told him I was family. I said, what the hell else did you tell me? He said, I told him you were my father. I was in a cardiovascular rehab at the Cooper Clinic, and 90 days later went in for an examination. The man said, I hate to tell you, but you've had another heart attack. And he said, do you remember when you had it? And I said, no, I don't remember any plane. He said, you have a real problem. You can't monitor your illness. And I said, yeah, that happened to me once before. Said we need to do an angiogram, and they did, and they said, hey, you need to have a triple bypass. And you know, one of the miraculous things as I stand up here this morning with kind of a rebuilt engine, it just, I don't advocate open heart surgery for an in-depth third step, but I'll tell you this, the night before open heart surgery, you will do an in-depth third step, and a 7th step, and 11th step, and every principle that you've ever known or been taught about the fellowship and the program, you will exercise. And there is a comforting security to that we have a way out. That no matter what has happened to us in the way of calamity, you can balance that with serenity. I was watching Clancy last night, and that scale meant so much to me because we've had a lot of adversity in sobriety. We still have living problems. But the fortunate part about that is you and I have living answers to keep that thing up in here. And that was very meaningful me to watch that scale last night. The daughter called 6-7 years ago and said, Dad, I'm having some problems. Could I bring the grandson and come to Texas? And I said, sure, honey, when are you coming? And she told me, and I said, you might want to pick another weekend because Mother's going to be at a woman-to-woman conference up in Oklahoma that weekend. And she said, no, I think I'd like to be with you, and she came down. And I've already told you I'm a father that's plagued with a tremendous amount of guilt, and I'm a very tangible person. And when I make my amends to my daughter and my children, it goes a little like this. Roxy, I'm so sorry for the things that I did, and I feel so badly for the promises that I made and couldn't keep. And God willing, it'll never happen again, and would you like a colored television set? I mean, I just want you to really know that I'm serious about this amend. And so the children understand that I'm not going to grow up, and when we go shopping, they're very careful not to point because they know I'll try and get it for them. And Roxy and I were shopping, and I said to her, I see in this morning's paper that George Shearing and Mel Torme are playing down at the Fairmont, and how would you like a night out on the town with your father? And she said, I'd love that. And we made arrangements for a sitter, and we got all fancy, and we went down to the Fairmont Hotel, and the maitre d' took us to our table, and the music began to play, and I said to Roxy, how would you like to dance? And what I'm about to tell you is the way I perceive what happened next. And as I'm holding Roxy and we're dancing, I heard her say, you're the greatest dad in all the world, and I love you so much, and you are so special, and you mean so much to me. And I have a relationship with my daughter today that I would not have known how to pray for, because I did not come here to be a good father or to be a good husband or to be a good anything. I came here to get the pain out, and I came here to get the heat off. And what you did was give me a set of personalities, or a set of principles that overpowered my personality, that makes me a functioning human being to my family, to my friends, and to my community, and I will be forever grateful. The oldest son continued to have problems in society, because if you and I cripple our children with the disease of alcoholism in the home, then we have no right to be startled when they have problems and limp and stumble in society. And Chuck continued to get into jail from time to time, and I would get upset over the fact that he was in jail. One time I remember, my God, he's 32 years old. When is he going to stay out of jail? I didn't stay out till I was 46, but you know, hey. I called one time and he was in jail on 2 counts of criminal mischief, and the bail had been set and the attorney's fees were $2,000, and I wrote this check for $2,000. I'm 12 years in the program, and this guilt-ridden father who wants to make amends is writing, you know, and Chuck will know that this $2,000 check is different. It's different from all the other checks. It's different from all the other money. It's different from co-signing all the cars. This time it'll be different. Any Al-Anon in this room can tell you that's not going to work, but when you're a guilt-ridden father, hey, you do the things that you think you need to do to put the pieces back together, and I sent the check down. And it wasn't very long before they called again, and he was back in jail on criminal harassment. And the bail had been set, and the attorney's fees had gone up, and as Chuck and I were talking, I don't know how it happened, but I said to Chuck, Chuck, I love you, but I ain't going to play anymore. And I don't know how you got in, and I don't know how you're going to get out, but I'm done. And I put the phone down. And I've heard Sally and I've heard the other Al-Anons talk about frozen emotions. And I was just standing there, and I couldn't even think to call my sponsor. And I called an Al-Anon that Sheila knows very well. And I said, Vanoy, I've just said no to my son for the first time in 12 years, and my heart is broken. And she said, of course it is. You're a father. But you got to work the steps. And I said, damn it, I know the steps, Vanoy. And she said, yeah, but you ain't working them. I said, well, for heaven's sakes, help me. And you know, she said, well, say out loud, you're powerless over your son and he makes your life unmanageable. And I'm up here going, I'm powerless over Chuck and he makes my life unmanageable. And I'm powerless over my son and he makes my life unmanageable. And there was like an extra light, just, you know, that's the way that was. And a power greater than myself will restore him to sanity, and a power greater than myself will restore me to sanity. I don't have that problem. And if I turn his will and his life over to the care of God, and I turn my will and my life over to the care of God, I don't have that problem. And she said, write down a couple of things that make you feel guilty about your son. And I remember writing that morning, making him do things that he didn't want to do when he was younger. You know, God had gifted him as an artist and a poet and a journalist, and that didn't mean anything to me. I wanted him to play organized football and baseball and basketball, and it's a competitive world out there, and one of these days you're really going to love me for having my foot in the middle of your back. You know, I used to get him by the shoulders, and I'd shove him up against the wall, and his eyeballs would get about that big around, and I used to say, damn you, you just get your hair cut, get to school on time, pick up your room. You do what I'm telling you to do, and you can be just like me. Boy, and he's looking out saying, I'll do anything but be like you. I had him up there one time, and I remember the eyes that they used to get, the hate, and he looked at me and he said, Dad, you're insane. I said, how dare you talk to me like that? By God, I put the clothes on your back and the food on the table and the roof over your head. Wasn't for me, you wouldn't have what you have. And I didn't know how true that was, and I left him in jail that day. And an Al-Anon took the pieces of a broken heart that day for me and put them back together, and I will be forever grateful. Chuck and I, over the next few years, became friends, and I went down to Austin to see him, and he came up to see me. And 3 or 4 years ago on Father's Day, he sent me a big card about that size, and there was a monkey on the front of it, all dressed up like Humphrey Bogart. And you opened it up on the inside, it said, here's looking at you, Dad. And then down below it had P.S. I just want to tell you how proud I am of what you've done with your life. You've certainly given me something to live up to. And from that point until last May, Chuck and I have had a good relationship. Sally and I were down in Austin last May for Mother's Day. And Chuck and Tom, the other son, and myself had a golf date, and we had a tea time at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and And we got out in about the second hole. It was about 7:15, 7:30, and I looked over, and Chuck and his friend Pete had a couple of beers out. And my thought was, hey, that's great. Those guys are having a good time. If that had been your son, I'd have gone, it's kind of interesting. I think I'll watch him. But he was my son, and I didn't think anything more about it. And Sally and I, we went out for dinner that night, and the following morning, Sunday morning, we drove by the house, and Chuck took Sally in his arms and said, Happy Mother's Day, Mom. And we left and went back to Dallas. At 12:30 that night, the phone rang, and the lady that Chuck was living with said, hey, I just want to tell you that Chuck trashed the house today, and there's blood everywhere, and the police have come, and they've taken him away. And my reaction was, you're kidding. And she said to me, don't you know he's a full-blown alcoholic? And I wanted to say, no, 20 years in the program, and I didn't see it. That's what I wanted to say. 6:30 the next morning, the telephone rang, and it was Charlie. And he said, Dad? And I said, yeah. I said, how you doing? He said, not very good. I said, what can I do for you? He said, I think I need to belong to your club. I said, oh, okay. He said, I'll tell you what you do. You stand still. I'll call a couple of guys in the program that I know, and they'll come get you. And they did. They went that day and stayed with him and picked him up and took him to a meeting that night and got his desire chip and his big book. Because you see in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous where it says, working with others, I can do that. I can swing over here and see your children and see untreated alcoholism, and I know exactly what to do with you. And somehow when I swing over here and look at my own, I see social misbehavior. I just cannot get the right vision on you. What I basically see is I have expectations that won't permit me to get total acceptance. And one of the things that Sally and I have been able to sleep very good about is the fact that we know when the time is right, you will save our children and we will save yours. Chuck, as far as I know, is not going to meetings. Chuck is, as far as I know, is not getting the program the way I would want him to get the program. But I don't have to feel guilty about that. And I don't have to worry about that. And just before Sally and I came up here, I called Austin because the two sons had their little nephew down visiting. And I said to Tom, the other son, I said, how was Charlie? He said, there's something that's happened to him. He's had an attitude change. He said, Karen even wants to have him over to the house for dinner. And I didn't have the heart to say, hey, you'll never know, Tom. I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying. How do you repay the fact, if my son had needed open heart surgery, I couldn't have called two fellas. But I want to tell you, when the disease of alcoholism is there, I could call two fellas and they went and saved my son. I don't know how you repay that back. And as far as I know, Charlie is doing fine, and I don't have to worry about that. He knows where the answer is. Tom, the middle son, that just left, they're going to have their second youngster in March, and Tom just calls me from time to time to say, hey, Dad, I love you. Little John, the guy that couldn't get out, used to keep a loaded shotgun for Sally and I, and when we would go in the bedroom to say hello, John would put his hand on the shotgun and say, what do you want? He hated my sobriety and my recovery so much in the beginning that he had to go back to Louisiana and live with a family for 6 months so Sally and I could get started. When he was in Berkner High School in Dallas, they kind of called us one day and said, if he'll just leave, we'll mail it to him. Because he was a problem constantly. One day they said, we need to have a conference with you, Mr. Myers, and I said, you bet. And I went up there, and that particular day there was a guidance counselor and a principal and about 3 or 4 teachers that had complained about John and his behavior. And as they went around the room that day taking John apart, they finally got to John, and they said to John, is there anything you'd like to talk about? And John said no. And then they said to me, is there anything you'd like to say? And I said, yes, I would. I said, what you don't know in this room is he's the product of an alcoholic home, and I am an alcoholic, and I'm a very active member of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And before I could even get it finished, the guidance counselor to my left went, oh, God, that's what's wrong with him. You know, and as it started to go around the room, and finally the guy said, you know, John is not a very good reader, and when he falls behind with his teacher, his tendency is to choose him one-on-one so he'll get thrown out of the class. Said, you know, we could get him some reading instructions over at Richland Junior College, and it was like the problem went from there to there the minute I said, hey, this is the way he is because of this. And within a year's time, he was offered an athletic scholarship to SMU that he couldn't utilize. But I want to tell you something. John is 34 years old today. He's president of his own company, lives in New York and Hong Kong, goes into China to negotiate manufacturing contracts for major ladies' sportswear manufacturers. And I want to tell you something, Sally and I are just aghast. I mean, this kid that couldn't get out of high school has had the advantages of the principles of the program. And he calls from time to time saying, you know, I'm going to be in Dallas, or maybe I can get there for Christmas. He wants to be with us. I've had a love-hate affair with my mother for a long time, as well as my father. I could love my mother as long as she was in Santa Cruz, California, and I was in Dallas, Texas. It was real easy to do. I had a great love affair at that distance. But over the years, when you put us in the same room together, it was a very uncomfortable thing. And my little 87-year-old mom, a few months back, was starting to have some physical problems. And I said to Sally, I said, you know, Mother's getting to be 87, and she's having a difficult time getting around, and maybe we should entertain the idea of bringing her back to Texas. It was almost like Bab said, God, did I really say that? And in one conversation with Mom 6-7 months ago, I said, Mother, why don't you give some thought about liquidating your things in California and come back here to Texas where we can love and hug you, and you can be near the family and we can take care of you. And she said, I'd like to think about that. And it wasn't very long. About a week later, she called and she said, I think I'd like to do that. And Sally and I found a nice little apartment just next to our place, about 30 paces away. And in May of this year, we brought my little 87-year-old mom back to Texas. I had no idea how to handle that. All I had was the principles of the program. And so I started to do step 1, and I started to do step 2, and Mother and I had to go to the bank one day. She had to open up her checking account. She had to move back her CD, and my normal tendency would have been, well, Mother, I think you need this checking account. Let's take that CD over there for 90 days, and we'll roll it over and see what happens, and be sure and put my signature on the checkbook in the event of your death, you know, and I thought, hey, I won't do that. And we went to the bank together. I picked her up. We sat down in front of this little bank officer, and I, you know, it was all I could do just to sit there and say, okay, God, go to work. And the next thing I know, the two of them, my mother and this bank officer, was, well, we'll do this checking account. Don't you think? We won't put his signature on there, but it'll be there in the event anything happens to him. We'll put this CD into trust. And you know, finally the lady talking to my mother said, you know, it looks like your son takes very good care of you. And my mother turned to this lady and she said, my son takes such good care of me. Now, I want to tell you something. We've had a call almost every day because Mother is starting to put all the basics back in the kitchen. And the first time we went to the grocery store, we got the sugar, and we got the flour, and we got the ketchup, and we got the salt, and we got the pepper, but we got home and forgot the rice vinegar, so we had to go get the rice vinegar, and then, you know, the following day we forgot the so it's been a real learning curve for me, because mothers will call and say, well, I don't want to take up your time, and I know you're so busy, and I move so slow. But I want to tell you something. Something special has happened there. I've been able to even the score. I've been able to be the son that I should have been and couldn't. I'm able to do things with her with a piece of feeling that I never thought would ever exist. And somehow the principles of the program and God in his loving wisdom has put me in a posture to take care of my mother. And it has been a blessing that I am just so startled by, I can't really describe it. It's nice to have a love affair going with your lady after 45 years, and you know, chronologically that's a long time, but Sally and I are still learning how to touch and feel and hear and see on a day-to-day basis, because when I first got here, this old Louisiana man said, "You'll date your wife every Friday." And I said, "Bill, we've been married for 25 years. Why the hell would I date my wife every Friday?" He said, "You don't understand. The alcohol has destroyed your senses, and you're going to have to learn how to touch and see and feel and hear all over again." And I had to come to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous to find out that having a good relationship is not finding the right person, it's being the right person. That my having a good love affair with my lady doesn't have anything to do with my lady. It has everything to do with my behavior. When my behavior is good, my love affair is good. When my behavior is funny, my love affair is funny. Everything that I have today that has value, has merit, has meaning, has love, has sensitivity, has structure, has come from the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Has come from people like Geneva and Babs and Clancy and, you know, people that I've stolen things from. The people that have created that path for me. And so I am in gratitude today to look down and see old friends and people that I love and to be a part of your conference. I don't have a close for this. You know, I just hope that I have openly been able to express the gratitude for all of the good things that have happened in my life. And I love you for being here. I hope your conference is an ongoing success, because these things are very, very important. And people work very hard, you know, to get good speakers and to carry quality messages of recovery to you. So I hope, you know, that you will do all of the things, because the lineup that you outlined for next year is dynamite and slam dunk. So, hey, I love you all. Thank you for having me.